Greetings, friends. My name is Jessa McLean, and I'm here to provide you with some blueprints of disruption. This weekly podcast is dedicated to amplifying the work of activists, examining power structures, and sharing the success stories from the grassroots. Through these discussions, we hope to provide folks with the tools and the inspiration they need to start to dismantle capitalism, decolonize our spaces, and bring about the political revolution that we know we need. Who would have thought, in all of the things that we've witnessed around Homeland Security and ICE, that we would be fixated on snowy Minnesota as this kind of crisis point, this place of incredible tension between federal authorities and community members. Not just that, it's federal authorities and state officials. Really hit a fever pitch, obviously, with the murder of Rebecca Good, filmed from every possible angle and played a million times over. It wasn't lost on people that this was less than a mile from where George Floyd was also murdered by authorities. And the responses have similarities, that's for sure. As Canadians, I'm sitting here watching this kind of resistance, street-level, community-based resistance on snowy streets, surely has us thinking, what if that were us? What if we had been Rebecca Good, parking our minivan across those lanes? What would we do if masked federal agents were roaming the streets and abducting our community members? And being relieved that we don't actually have to answer that question, except we do. We do have to face this head on. We do have to start contemplating what we would do in those circumstances, because Santiago and I are here to talk about just how similar Canadian immigration is to U.S. immigration policy in terms of legislation, attitude, and trajectory, really. So what's top of mind for you, though, Santiago? We've been watching ICE for a while. I know we check in and check out as we can handle it at the moment, but it's hard to look away right now. And it seems to hit a whole new level.
Yeah, it's everywhere we look, right? Clips are going viral of all the different confrontations, everything that those fucking arrogant ICE agents are saying, that how enabled they feel by the murder. They're bragging about it in the streets. They're, using it as look what we did to you. This is what we're going to keep doing to you. Do you want to end up like her? And Minnesota's not far away at all, Minnesota shares a border here with Ontario. Minnesotans, even their accent's pretty Canadian, right? Yeah, people who know me know I don't particularly care or believe in the concept of borders. So for me, that might as well be neighbors who are going through this. And it's always, I always talk about how such a core element of Canadian identity is this better than Americanism, right? This idea that as long as we can do the same things, but as long as we do them a little bit more humanely, we let ourselves off the hook for so many things. And I feel I'm not sensing enough rage coming from Canada about this, And one thing I was mentioning to you and I was thinking about was back in elementary school, when they're teaching about Canadian history, there's so much emphasis on the concept of the Underground Railroad as this moment of Canadian pride, right? About how when the US was rounding up slaves, that Canada was a safe haven and a place that fought against slavery, erasing our own slave history, mind you. They never taught you back then that Canada had slaves too. But that's like a core part of like Canadian history and Canadian identity, you know? That's what they want you growing up and seeing Canada as, right? And I just can't help but think about, while I look at this, just how fucking pathetic we are in, you know, just like our complete, like, there's not enough like of a call to like be a safe haven to protect people. And it's the opposite. Our government's moving towards making it more difficult for us to protect people that, like I said, they might as well be your neighbors. What the fuck is the difference between like Manitoba and Ontario and Minnesota? Like what's the difference? There's no difference. You know, we're the same people. Why, like, anyways, that's what's on my mind right now.
Yeah, I think it's like that mistaken identity, though, when you say it's part of our Canadian identity. We do that quite well, don't we? Maybe it's a way to insulate ourselves from those horrors, right? And yeah, we do it in a more humane way, a bureaucratic way, right? We're setting the stage to do what Donald Trump is doing in a more legal framework, probably, which is even more dangerous because this is what's happening under a liberal government. And again, you asked me earlier, what would it actually look like under a conservative government, when maybe it would look exactly like what we're seeing to the south. I want to go back there just for a second, because I know folks are maybe catching it on their social media feeds, but just to get an idea of how rough it is, like we saw Rebecca Good, obviously, her murder, and there are lots of reasons why we know her name over a lot of other people who've been murdered by police and ICE. And in fact, a lot of folks have died under ICE detention. In 2025, it like took a, I don't know, it's like 85% uptick. 32 people died in ICE custody. Some of those were children. 6 people have died so far in 2026. And like, these are all migrants. And less than half of the folks that are currently in detention right now, they have 70,000 people in detention. They say they got capacity for 100K because they deport them quite quickly. So ICE have rounded up, you know, I don't know how much you can trust the numbers coming right from Homeland Security, but The Guardian is also trying to track these numbers as best they can. And it's like over 350,000 people, and about the same number has been deported. Like there's a couple tens of thousands difference. And then there's folks that we don't even know where they are. But at any given time, you know, they have between 50 and 70,000 people sitting in these detention facilities, and less than half are facing any charges. And we always spend so much time pointing at all these other democracies and stuff. This is such a side note, but like just south of us, the most horrendous fascist shit is happening, you know, foreign policy. And it's not till it like directly impacts us do we actually start really paying attention. But yeah, Canadians sitting on looking in horror should really redirect that rage to Carney, honestly, because there's not much you can do about Trump's policies. You can support comrades in the South, and, you know, there's some mutual aid programs going around, and there's ways you can help. But just like when we advocate for Palestine and all the other things that we talk about, there's work to do at home inside the belly of the beast. We are not just some kind of innocent third party. I'll link Desmond Cole's video. He does a great job of kind of pointing out a few of the ways Canadian authorities actually work with ICE and Homeland Security. Our border security has been integrated with the U.S. Authorities for a long time, and Carney and Trudeau further integrated those systems. We're talking about adding 1,000 officers, right? We call them CBSA officers. They call them ICE agents. Ours don't wear masks, I guess, maybe unless it's really cold. They might get away with that. That can't be their excuse in Minnesota, though, because they're wearing them in fucking Florida, too. But, we are setting the infrastructure up and the legislation up to operate in a very, very similar manner. There are organizations here that we can link in the show notes as well that are and have been mounting massive campaigns for years. And, we're actually gaining a little bit of traction before that last year and a half of Trudeau's term and then into Carney's. It's just kind of exploded. And yeah, I agree with you, Santiago. Because of the lack of rage, I think it's getting a lack of attention too. There seems to be a manufactured consent, maybe not even manufactured. Like, there's a lot of people that in this elbows up mentality took to this, like, take care of their own, right? And that meant, like, take care of Canadians first. And that's not a far stretch from, like, demanding they have papers for that worth.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that we're like, it's entirely conceivable that our near future could look very similar to what's going on in the States, right? Just one election goes a little bit different, and who knows what could happen, right? I mean, we've been setting the stage for building that similar mentality for a long time, that anti-immigrant rhetoric that we've been hearing and that we've been warning about. This is the path that it leads on, right? A lot of, and what's frustrating is, like, we have to hold ourselves accountable. And when I say us, I mean us so-called leftists of whatever colors, we have to hold each other accountable, because there's entirely too many leftists out there even who buy into some of this anti-immigration rhetoric, and finding different ways to justify, like whether or not, like, we don't have the infrastructure, like it's taking away from certain issues, like we don't have the housing, that like this is the path that it leads under, and one argument that I've always made is when it comes to, like, countries like Canada and the United States, these imperial powers that, like like what just happened in Venezuela, U.S. goes in and snatches someone, or when Canada is one of the major players in supporting the coup in Bolivia, or in Haiti, right, or all of the different examples where the United States has destabilized in Guatemala, Nicaragua, fucking, Chile, fucking wherever, right? Well, you create these conditions in these countries of instability. You create refugee crisis. You create conditions where people want to leave their countries. I don't know if for those of y'all who have never been to Latin America, it's a beautiful, beautiful place, It's rich in culture, in food, in natural beauty. You think people just want to leave because of what, it takes a lot. It takes a lot for people to want to leave their homes.
Oh, they vacation there, Santiago. They know it's beautiful. They don't draw this connection, though.
Yeah, we love vacationing there. And so Canada has always played a major part in destabilizing these regions for economic gains for Western powers, right? So then you create these crises. You have all these people who are now looking to live a better life, because then we project ourselves. Canada, especially, even more than the United States, has such a rich and strong public image that the world, like, wants to be a part of that. They want to come here and they live it, because that's who we project, even though it's not who we are, right? So we create that, we manufacture that, and then we have the audacity to then reject these claims, to turn people away, to make enemies out of these people, to villainize these people,
They're just like widgets in a system, in an economic system, right? They're just units of measure to folks making policy, and they'll let them in when it's convenient for our labor market and turn off the tap when that's convenient, and point people to demonize them when we're in economic crisis so that they can enact more authoritarian legislation. It's an old pattern. It's such an old pattern. but one that, yeah, we've been able to mask quite well. I mean, a fine look, a close look at our labor history, and it's obvious. But that's not really part of the learning process most people go through. I doubt very many people get to take a class in Canadian labor history. We should do, or in Canadian immigration policy history. I did. But we should do an episode because literally even the names of the acts passed are inherently racist. I should have mentioned this when you were talking about that image of Canada as a safe haven. In fact, we think the United States is a safe haven. So if we think like, well, what could Carney do to possibly help all these migrants, right? This is not our business. What could we even do from here? Let's pretend he wasn't a xenophobic banker and he wanted to help. He could repeal the Safe Third Country Agreement that we have with the United States. And I'm going to go on a bit of a tirade on this one because I think I've mentioned this before. I must have, because I said to Santiago, I feel like this campaign started in my childhood. And so I brushed up on it before we came into the studio, and it's not far off. Well, we'll say that. Like 2006, Amnesty International started, which is like just 2-3 years after the legislation was passed, started flagging this as a problem. Because what the Safe Third Party Agreement does, it declares the United States and Canada as safe for migrants, meaning if you land there first, you must claim asylum there. You can't walk through or travel through one safe country just to apply to another. So if you came through from the United States to Canada, they would say, why didn't you apply in the United States? It's so safe for you there. You see how ridiculous this already sounds, right? So when people started using irregular crossings, there were some exceptions to this rule. And again, courts have even ruled this unconstitutional, but it's just been kicked around the courts and nothing's really been done with it, except that they fucking expanded it to include irregular crossings. So people were trying to avoid this awful legislation, this unconstitutional legislation, and use irregular crossings, which are inherently unsafe. So what did we do? Rather than repeal the act, as they had been petitioned to for 20 years at this point almost, they said, okay, fine, anybody anywhere trying to get through the United States is going to be turned back. And that we'll never know the impact that's resulted in. What's happened to all of those migrants that were sent back at the border. Right? They're like, ICE can hardly track the people that they round up now, let alone how we have contributed to the people that they have in detention there. So, yeah, just the fact that this legislation, even despite being ruled by our Supreme Court as ridiculous, and the courts even implied that the United States is not safe. We're at this point that, despite all of our misgivings, not only are we turning them away at the border, but we're sending them vehicles too, right? World Beyond War is part of their episode here. Rachel reminded us that like armored vehicles made in Brampton are being shipped to ICE agents in the South. So I sat through this webinar put on by Surge, and it was incredible. It featured migrant rights activists. And one of the points that S.K. Hussain made that really struck home and helped me understand a lot of what's happening is he's talked about the elbows up movement, right? Movement. I don't know if you can call it that. That's kind of generous. Whatever that was, it was like fucking rhetoric around the election, a lot of it. But he drew attention to the fact that it was inherently anti-Indigenous and anti-migrant, right? It was about, in the end, complete resource extraction. But most importantly, what we've seen now is it was a consolidation, or is a consolidation of capital and the ruling class for Canada and the United States. that the tariff war is really just a sideshow, masking the reality that we are further integrating and aligning ourselves economically. It might seem like we're creating a new world order, but there's a lot of evidence that we are just lock in step with U.S. policy on a lot of things. And migration is one of them. Let's list the ways that we're similar, right? So I mentioned the fact that the safe third country agreement, we're just like, yeah, we're safe, you're safe, we're good. And it's just absolutely ridiculous. But you'll see in Desmond Cole's video that we'll link here that we look at these detention facilities with such ire. Well, Canada has its own detention facilities. We also detain children. There's no limits on how long we'll detain people. And people do die in detention. Right? They do die while getting deported. Right now, under current legislation, without the impacts of Bill C-12, which we'll talk about a little bit, migrant rights activists estimate that right now, because of the changes in the visa policies, 3,000 people a day are losing status. So that means they either have to leave or they have to stay undocumented by design, right? And there is a lot of evidence to support the fact that they don't actually even want these people to leave, right? This isn't being done as a solution to housing or as to free up healthcare resources, right? Which a lot of leftists use to rationalize this kind of numbers game in terms of limiting migration. Right? They're not doing it for these reasons. They're doing it to create a more exploitable labor force. People who need to operate under fear of being deported at any moment. Does that sound familiar? That sounds familiar, right? They're not maybe in masks yanking them out of vehicles in the most violent way imaginable, but there's still 3,000 people around you daily that are faced with this awful choice. That's violence. That's violence in a completely different form.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing, right? Is that when it comes to, like, Canada has profited so much. Our economy is built on the exploitation of migrants. You know, whether it's our agriculture industry or who's funding our Ontario colleges, for example, right? Like, migrants are the foundational, well, the exploitation of migrants is the foundational bedrock. And when you look at it, like, there's no valid way to frame this as economic concerns because, you know, the average migrant contributes more to the Canadian economy than a person born here, right? And I don't even want to make that argument because, like, that's...
You saw the look on my face. I was like, because Harsha Walia, she made that point in that webinar there where it was like, we can't talk about that. We can talk about how, like, 1 in 9 of people in the workplace are migrants. But yeah, the inherent right to cross these arbitrary borders exists, right? And that's kind of should be the basis of how we push. But...
yeah, like I said in the beginning, I don't even really believe in the concept of borders at all, right? Like, the idea of nation states is inherently exclusive. I also, like, if I'm getting honest about it, like, I don't believe, like, I think humans are too spread out around the world. Like, I don't think we need to inhabit every corner of the planet, and borders just make it so that, like, we end up taking up more land than is needed to sustain humanity, you know, and has disastrous consequences to our sustainability in building the world. You know, like, there's no reason for us to be living in deserts and in land that cannot sustain agriculture, and then like having to tear down forests to try and use whatever, like, growable land. You know, like, it's nonsense. Like, the way that we are living is nonsense. There's no logic to it. We've just gone so far back words on this issue. Like, it was it wasn't that long ago when, during the Trudeau government, they were promising that any day now, you know, migrants would get, like, their status for all. You know, we made all these promises, and people came here under promises, and now we're betraying that and blaming them for it. You know, it's cruel, and it's just so frustrating, the lack of will, the lack of outrage, you know, like it shouldn't. The one thing we talk about on the show is that, like, it shouldn't take things falling apart and us having to witness violence for us to take action. And that's what I'm a little bit worried about in Canada, right? I'm worried that because we don't have a literal fucking Gestapo on the streets, that we're okay with the rest of it. Because this bureaucratic deportations that we're doing, you know, how many people is it that are set to lose status in the next year in Canada? It's like 1 million.
It is, yeah.
Right?
That year started already because the changes happened under Trudeau. So,
yeah, like, maybe that's not you, but, like, do you know how difficult that is?
that's 1 in 14 of us. Looking around you at the supermarket, at your school, at your workplace. 1 in 14. And, like, that's a big number, people. Right? Like, that is a huge chunk of your community. And I want to go back to Santiago's point of, like, borders, right? It almost came in as not that it should be a side topic to this fucking issue, but the creation of borders goes in hand with the creation of migrants. And I don't mean what Santiago talked about, where, like, economic, political crisis force people to leave. I mean, the actual label of a migrant. The idea that we've given a special label to somebody who has traversed the planet and is living in a different spot. That label was specifically created in order to have a different class of worker, right? To create a sub-proletariat. Because it's an absurd term. Right? We use expat when we talk about white people going other places, and we have levels to which we refer to migrants. But just the idea of a migrant, yeah, it's usually reserved for anyone coming from the global south going to the global north. It's arbitrarily applied, but it is a designation that economies use, right? Very specifically to impact their labor market, the bottom dollar. They want migrants, right? They just want them living in the most precarious ways possible, so that the closer they got to getting status, the more of a danger that they came. That became actually a crisis for capital. Then who will they scapegoat? Where will that labor come from for them?
And by labor, it really is slave labor is what it is. I mean, I've said it before, but, you know, like, the United Nations has said that Canada's, like, temporary foreign worker program, for example, is a modern day form of slavery. And I just want to make a point here too, because, like, let's not be short-sighted here. What we are about to experience as the world, like, let's be clear, we're not doing enough to tackle the climate crisis, right? What that means is we're going to face mass drought, famine, instability around the world in the coming decades. You know, let's be realistic, and we need to fight as hard as we can to prevent this, but, like, a certain amount of that is locked in at this point, right? Canada is an incredibly sparsely populated country that has large amounts of livable land. We have the most amount of fresh water in the world, and we have an incredibly small population. We're the second biggest country in the world. And even if you forget about the fact that the Arctic is, like, incredibly hard to, like, forget about, like, that, like, we have large amounts of land where we can build cities. We have large amount of farmlands that can support agriculture. And with modern agricultural practices, we have more than enough to sustain an incredibly large population. We have a moral obligation to accept migrants in the coming years. Mass amounts, much more than, like, much more than the shit we're fighting about now. Because the world is going to be in agony. There's going to be mass starvation, migrant crisis all around the world. And having what we have, the ability to support a much, much larger population than what we have. And like, you can talk about infrastructure. You know, you build infrastructure. You bring in migrants. Guess what? They get jobs building infrastructure. It's not that difficult. We did it with the Italians and the Portuguese, you know? It's basic. If we do not, we are endorsing the deaths of millions of people. So get used to it. You know, this isn't like the shit we're arguing about right now. The numbers of migrants, that's tiny compared to what's going to be happening. Get used to it. And like, get over it. You know? Because the alternative is truly despicable shit. Like, it is a complete lack of humanity. And it is only justifiable under like the most vile racism. And like, I just feel like everything we're talking about is just so short-sighted, you know?
And that's what made me so angry when I would be seeing good people, leftists, finding room for this narrative, right? That somehow the amount of migrants that we let into the country was playing into whether or not they could get a doctor's appointment or affordable housing, right? And because we knew it would make space for worse things to come, and it did. Right? This isn't the conservatives passing this, although it is Carney playing to them, trying to outflank them. But for his own sake, not just a political maneuver, C12 does things that Trump is doing now that we balk at, right? On top of the other bits of funding. So like just throwing millions of dollars at the border, right? Militarizing the same kind of agency that we're all looking at going, oh, he increased the funding by ICE by this much and they get $40,000 signing bonus. Yet this was a major campaign promise by almost all of the parties in the Canadian election, the federal election, right? Was more officers. They all had a different number, but they all thought that was some sort of solution to any of our problems. And it made space for this. And so now the immigration minister, he's going to have powers, the kind of powers that we use to turn back boats of Jews during the Holocaust, that we used to intern Japanese nationalists here in Canada, right? Where he's going to have just sweeping powers to revoke the visas and applications for people of a whole country, of a certain demographic, on a whim with almost no oversight. A ministers, think of the cabinet shuffles. Think of the schmucks that go in and out of some of these ministers' jobs, right? Like they know nothing of what's needed in migration. They are not focused on human rights. They are literally working in tandem with the labor minister, which doesn't exist anymore. So I guess like that's just really part of his job, is just making those adjustments with human lives. And knowing that we see marches, as lame as they are, protected by police, are happening in every city across Canada, right? Anti-immigration march, white nationalist marches. We look to the UK to see like how bad those riots could get, like quite easily, and how that takes hold. And, you know, we are seeing counter protests, and you know, I'm not organizing any of them myself, so I'm definitely not going to criticize them. But they aren't feeling as much heat as they should, considering the messages that they're able to just put on their placards and walk around our cities with. And I think that's because there is appetite. We are a settler nation, inherently racist, that turn to protect ourselves when in a moment of crisis, because that's all we've known, even though we can do it with paper instead of maybe at the end of a rifle for now. But choosing to not play into this now is a huge mistake. And folks have been organizing to this end for quite some time, like the Migrant Rights Alliance, Justice for Migrant Workers. We'll link a whole bunch of folks in the notes. And there's been legal cases and all of that. But, you know, I would argue that we should look to Minnesota and the kind of response that the Americans had to get to when it got so bad as a kind of first line of defense for us, right? Just because border agents in Canada don't come in the same way as ICE agents do doesn't mean we shouldn't still be trying to stop deportations by any means, you know? No doubt by now, like, your social media feeds are hopefully full of images of resistance, right? Different ways. We don't all have to take big risks, but we do have to do something. People are being very creative, yet defiant. I've seen things like when immigration officers come in, everyone sets up their car alarm, gets on the horn, tells everybody to lock their doors. Folks are teaching each other what to do if ICE agents come to the workplace looking for a coworker, what they do if they come into a school looking for a coworker. Cities are deciding how they're going to respond. Should they be inundated by federal agents in the same way places in Minnesota are being? And there's something all of us can do, but all of it requires you to organize within your communities. To stay unabashedly left on this, not to give one fucking inch to these anti-immigrant sentiments that are floating around, not 1 inch. And just know that the more capitalism relies on the exploitation of migrants is more reason for all leftist organizations and folks to use this, right, as that power play against capitalism to create a bigger crisis for it, right? By granting status to migrants, to pushing back against, the idea of borders. So we don't all, they killed Rebecca Good because she was doing what she could. They wanted to scare us and everybody else away. That's why they kind of doubled down as well. There is this need to create a boiling point. And, we just can't be deterred in this moment. I think sometimes you can look to the South and will it steel us against something like that? Will it serve as its warning sign? Well, only if we talk about it that way, right? Or will we look to it as something that begins to be normalized, right? That is in our hands right now, I believe. Right? We're at a critical moment before it gets too late.
That is a wrap on another episode of Blueprints of Disruption. Thank you for joining us. Also, a very big thank you to the producer of our show, Santiago Helou Quintero. Blueprints of Disruption is an independent production operated cooperatively. You can follow us on Twitter at BP of Disruption. If you'd like to help us continue disrupting the status quo, please share our content, and if you have the means, consider becoming a patron. Not only does our support come from the progressive community, so does our content. So reach out to us and let us know what or who we should be amplifying. So until next time, keep disrupting.